My name is Emma Rodriguez, and for 27 years I was the family charity case. At least, that's what my sisters Jessica and Amanda made crystal clear every time we gathered for our annual family reunion. Last December, sitting in the ornate dining room of the Palmer House Hotel, they outdid themselves. Jessica, resplendent in her designer black cocktail dress, held up the small wooden music box I'd inherited from our great-aunt Martha and laughed so hard she nearly spilled her champagne. Emma got the $2 garage sale special, she announced to our extended family, her voice carrying that particular brand of cruelty that only siblings can perfect. While we got the real jewelry and furniture, she gets this broken toy that doesn't even play a full song. The room erupted in polite chuckles, but what happened next silenced them all. A distinguished man in an impeccable gray suit approached our table, introduced himself as Henrik Larsson from the First International Bank of Zurich, and said words that would change everything. "Miss Rodriguez, I believe you have something that belongs to my bank. That music box contains the access key to an account your great-aunt established. The current balance is approximately $80 million. The laughter stopped. Jessica's champagne glass hit the table with a sharp clink, and I realized that sometimes the most precious gifts come wrapped in the most humble packages. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I wasn't always the one my family pitied. There was a time when I was the golden child, the one with the acceptance letter to Northwestern University's social work program, the one who volunteered at homeless shelters on weekends, while my sisters focused on their GPAs and internship applications. Back then, Jessica and Amanda would actually seek my advice about boys, about college applications, about life in general. "Emma always knows what to do," Amanda used to tell her friends, back when she still had braces and looked up to me with genuine admiration. Those days felt like a lifetime ago as I sat in that hotel dining room, watching my sisters flaunt their success like peacocks displaying their feathers. Jessica had become everything our parents dreamed of in a daughter. At 31, she was a partner at Morrison Blake & Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious real estate law firms. Her Gold Coast penthouse overlooked Lake Michigan, and her Instagram feed was a carefully curated showcase of client dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, weekend trips to Napa Valley, and designer handbags that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She drove a white BMW convertible and wore shoes that clicked authoritatively across marble lobbies as she closed million-dollar property deals for Chicago's elite. Amanda, 2 years younger than Jessica, had carved out her own impressive territory in the financial world. As a senior investment banker at Sterling Financial, she managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions and lived in a sprawling colonial mansion in Evanston with her surgeon husband David and their twin boys. Her life was a testament to strategic planning and calculated success. Every December, she would arrive at our family gathering with stories of her latest triumph, whether it was securing funding for a major downtown development or being featured in Chicago Business Magazine's 40 Under 40 Inches list. Then there was me, 27 years old, living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park, working as a community center coordinator for a nonprofit that served underprivileged families on the South Side. My Honda Civic had a dent in the passenger door from a parking mishap 3 years ago that I still couldn't afford to fix. While my sisters collected designer purses, I collected thank you cards from kids who learned to read in our after-school program. While they networked at charity galas, I distributed hygiene kits to homeless individuals under Lower Wacker Drive. Our definitions of wealth couldn't have been more different. The shift in our family dynamic hadn't happened overnight. It began during my junior year at Northwestern, when I made what my family considered a catastrophic decision. I was studying for my LSATs, planning to follow Jessica into law school, when I started volunteering at a community center in Humboldt Park. The work was supposed to be a resume builder, something to make my law school applications stand out. Instead, it became the thing that changed my entire perspective on life. I remember the exact moment everything clicked. A 12-year-old girl named Sophia had been struggling with her homework in our tutoring program. Her mother worked 3 jobs and couldn't help her with assignments, and Sophia was falling behind in school despite being incredibly bright. When I helped her understand a particularly challenging math concept and watched her face light up with comprehension, I felt something I'd never experienced in any pre-law class. It was purpose, pure and simple. For the first time in my life, I wasn't working towards some future goal or trying to impress anyone. I was making a difference right now in this moment for this child. That realization led to another, then another. I started spending more time at the community center, less time studying for the LSATs. I changed my major from pre-law to social work, despite my parents' horrified protests. "You're throwing away your potential," my father said during one particularly heated family dinner. "Jessica's going to make partner before she's 35. Amanda's already being recruited by top firms. And you want to work with poor people for $30,000 a year?" The disappointment in their voices was crushing, but not as crushing as the idea of spending my life doing work that felt meaningless to me. I finished my degree in social work, graduated with honors, and immediately took a position at the Garfield Community Center. The pay was indeed terrible, but the work filled me with a sense of purpose that no amount of money could buy. Every day brought new challenges and small victories. I helped families navigate social services, taught computer skills to seniors, organized food drives, and ran youth programs that kept kids off the streets and in school. My sisters, however, viewed my career choice as a personal affront to the family's upward mobility. Jessica would introduce me to her colleagues as my sister who works with charity cases, while Amanda would shake her head sadly whenever anyone asked about my job, as if I were suffering from some temporary mental illness that prevented me from pursuing real success. Family gatherings became exercises in endurance as I listened to detailed accounts of their professional achievements, while deflecting pointed questions about when I planned to go size about my career. The inheritance from Great-Aunt Martha came at a particularly low point in my relationship with my family. Martha had been the black sheep of the Rodriguez clan, a woman who had never married, never had children, and had spent most of her adult life traveling the world. She lived in Switzerland for 30 years before returning to a small cottage in rural Wisconsin, where she'd spent her final decade as a recluse who barely spoke to any of us. When she died at 89, leaving behind a will that distributed her possessions among her great-nieces and great-nephews, no one expected anything particularly valuable. Jessica inherited Martha's jewelry collection, which included several pieces that appraised for thousands of dollars. Amanda received Martha's antique furniture, including a dining room set that was worth enough to finance a luxury vacation. Uncle Robert got her vintage car collection. Cousin Michael inherited her rare book library, and various other relatives received paintings, china, and other items of obvious value. I received a music box. It was small, maybe 6 inches square, made of dark wood that had seen better decades. The velvet interior was faded and worn, and when you opened the lid, it played exactly 2 notes of what might have been a classical melody before the mechanism gave up entirely. There was no accompanying jewelry, no hidden compartments that anyone could see, nothing that suggested it had any value beyond sentimental. The will specifically mentioned that it had been Martha's most treasured possession, but to everyone else, it looked like something you'd find at a garage sale with a $2 price tag. Jessica's reaction when the lawyer handed me the music box was immediate and merciless. "Seriously? That's it?" she said, not even trying to hide her amusement. "Martha must have really run out of good stuff by the time she got to you." Amanda joined in, examining the box with exaggerated interest. "Maybe it's vintage enough to be worth something on eBay, like $10 if you're lucky." The lawyer cleared his throat uncomfortably, but said nothing to defend the bequest. Even he seemed to think I'd gotten the short end of the stick. I took the music box home to my apartment and placed it on my nightstand, where it served as a daily reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. Every morning when I woke up, I'd see it sitting there, silent and apparently worthless, a perfect metaphor for how my relatives viewed my life choices. Sometimes I'd open the lid just to hear those 2 lonely notes, wondering what song it was supposed to play and why Martha had considered it her most treasured possession. What I didn't know was that Martha had been far more complex than any of us realized. What I didn't know was that her 30 years in Switzerland hadn't been spent as a simple expatriate, but as someone who had built a fortune through careful investments and international business ventures. What I didn't know was that the unassuming music box sitting on my nightstand contained a secret that would make my sister's designer lifestyles look like child's play. But I would find out soon enough, in the most public and humiliating way possible for my sisters, at the annual Rodriguez family reunion that December. The Palmer House Hotel was Jessica's choice for our family gathering, a decision that perfectly encapsulated her need to showcase her success. She'd reserved the private dining room on the 7th floor, the one with crystal chandeliers and gold-trimmed wallpaper that screamed old money and exclusivity. 23 members of the Rodriguez extended family gathered around the massive mahogany table, everyone dressed in their finest attire for what had become an annual display of professional one-upmanship. I'd almost skipped the dinner entirely. The previous year's gathering had been particularly brutal, with Jessica spending most of the evening regaling everyone with stories about her latest client victories, while Amanda showed off photos of her family's European vacation. I'd sat quietly in the corner, nursing a single glass of wine and counting the minutes until I could politely excuse myself. But something had compelled me to attend this year. Maybe a stubborn refusal to let my sisters drive me away from my own family, or maybe just curiosity about what new heights of condescension they might achieve. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, settling on a simple black dress that I'd bought for job interviews 3 years earlier, and a pair of modest heels that wouldn't embarrass me but certainly wouldn't impress anyone either. I'd brought the music box with me, not because I planned to show it off, but because I'd developed a strange attachment to it over the months since Martha's death. It had become a kind of talisman, a reminder that not everything valuable could be measured in dollars and cents. The evening started predictably enough. Jessica dominated the conversation with stories about her latest real estate triumph, a deal that had netted her firm millions in commissions and earned her a feature in the Chicago Tribune's business section. Amanda chimed in with news of her promotion to senior vice president, a position that came with a corner office and a salary that would have funded my community center's entire annual budget. Uncle Robert regaled us with tales of his recent golf trip to Scotland, while cousin Michael showed off his new Rolex. Then Jessica spotted the music box sitting beside my purse on the side table where I'd placed it when we arrived. Her eyes lit up with malicious glee, and I knew I was about to become the evening's entertainment. "Oh my God, Emma brought Martha's little garage sale treasure," she announced, reaching for the box before I could stop her. "Everyone, you have to see this. This is what our dear great-aunt thought was worth passing down to future generations." She held up the music box like a prosecutor presenting evidence, turning it so everyone could see its worn exterior and faded details. "It doesn't even work properly. Listen to this." She opened the lid, and those two pathetic notes echoed through the dining room, followed by the grinding sound of... Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A mechanism that had given up decades ago. The room filled with the kind of polite laughter that accompanies someone else's embarrassment, and I felt my cheeks burn with familiar shame. "I mean, I get that Martha was eccentric," Amanda added, taking the box from Jessica and examining it with theatrical interest. "But this is just sad. Emma, honey, you should probably just donate this to Goodwill. At least then someone might get some use out of it." More laughter rippled around the table, and I found myself wishing I could disappear into the elaborate carpet beneath my feet. That's when the maitre d' approached our table with an apologetic expression, and a message that would change everything. "Excuse me," he said quietly, "but there's a gentleman here who says he needs to speak with Miss Emma Rodriguez about a matter of some urgency. He says it concerns an inheritance." The conversation stopped mid-sentence. All eyes turned to me as I followed the maitre d' toward the dining room entrance, my heart pounding with confusion and embarrassment. Standing just outside the door was a tall, distinguished man in an impeccably tailored gray suit, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested both authority and discretion. He looked like he'd stepped out of a European banking advertisement, which, as it turned out, wasn't far from the truth. "Miss Rodriguez," he said in accented English, extending his hand with a slight bow. "My name is Henrik Larsson. I represent the First International Bank of Zurich. I believe you have something that belongs to my institution, and I have something that belongs to you." My hands trembled slightly as I shook Henrik Larsson's hand, acutely aware that 23 pairs of eyes were watching from the dining room behind me. His grip was firm and reassuring, but his words made no sense. A bank in Switzerland? Something that belonged to them. I glanced back at the music box still clutched in Amanda's hands, then back at this mysterious banker who had appeared out of nowhere on what was supposed to be just another humiliating family gathering. "I'm sorry, Mr. Larson," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "but I think there might be some mistake. I don't have any connection to Switzerland, and certainly nothing that would interest a bank." Behind me, I could hear the murmur of confused voices as my family tried to piece together what was happening. Jessica's laugh had died completely, replaced by a tension that seemed to fill the entire dining room. Henrik smiled gently, the kind of expression that suggested he'd had this conversation before under similar circumstances. "Miss Rodriguez, may I ask if you inherited a music box from your great-aunt, Martha Rodriguez, formerly Martha Rodriguez Steinberg?" The hyphenated surname caught me off guard. In all the years I'd known Martha, no one had ever mentioned a second last name, let alone one that sounded distinctly European. "Yes," I replied slowly, "but it's just an old music box. It barely even plays." I gestured toward Amanda, who was still holding the item in question like it might contaminate her designer dress. "My family was just commenting on how worthless it appears to be." The banker's expression shifted slightly, and for the first time, I detected something that might have been amusement in his pale blue eyes. "Miss Rodriguez, appearances can be quite deceiving. Your great-aunt was one of our most valued clients for over 3 decades. The music box you inherited is not simply a keepsake. It contains something that we have been waiting 60 years to return to the proper heir." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. I felt Uncle Robert move closer behind me, clearly trying to overhear our conversation, while the rest of the family pretended to resume their dinner conversations while straining to catch every word. Jessica had gone completely silent, which in itself was remarkable enough to make me wonder if I was dreaming. "I don't understand," I said, which was perhaps the most honest thing I'd spoken all evening. "Martha lived in a cottage in Wisconsin. She didn't have any money. She was practically a hermit." Even as I said the words, I realized how little any of us actually knew about Martha's life. She'd been the family mystery, the relative who sent Christmas cards from Switzerland for 30 years, before returning to America and withdrawing from all of us almost completely. Henrik nodded patiently. "Your great-aunt was indeed a very private person, especially in her later years. But during her time in Switzerland, she was far from a hermit. She was a remarkably astute businesswoman who built a considerable fortune through investments, real estate acquisitions, and what you might call international consulting. She chose to live modestly in her final years, but she never forgot her family, particularly the great niece who reminded her most of herself in her younger days." I blinked hard, certain I'd misheard him. "Reminded her of herself?" "Mr. Larson, I think you might have me confused with one of my sisters. They're the successful ones. Jessica's a partner at a law firm, and Amanda's a senior vice president at an investment bank. I work at a community center." The words came out with the practiced self-deprecation I'd perfected over years of family gatherings, the automatic diminishment of my own worth that had become second nature. The banker's smile widened slightly. "Miss Rodriguez, your great-aunt specifically mentioned your work with underserved communities in her correspondence with our bank. She was quite proud of your dedication to helping others, and she felt it demonstrated the same strength of character that had guided her own unconventional path. She often said that true wealth meant nothing if it wasn't used to make the world better for those who had less." I stared at him, trying to process information that challenged everything I thought I knew about my family and myself. Martha had known about my work. She'd been proud of it. The woman I remembered as distant and disconnected had apparently been following my life closely enough to discuss it with Swiss bankers. The revelation was so unexpected that it took me a moment to register the increasing agitation behind me. "Emma," Jessica's voice cut through my confusion with its familiar edge of impatience. "What exactly is going on here? Are you going to keep us all waiting while you chat with this stranger?" There was something forced about her casual tone, as if she were trying very hard to maintain her air of superiority while clearly being rattled by this unexpected development. Henrik glanced toward the dining room, then back at me with a questioning look. Would you prefer to discuss this matter privately, or would you like your family to be present? What I have to tell you will likely come as quite a surprise to everyone. There was something in his tone that suggested he understood exactly what kind of family dynamics he'd walked into, and that he was giving me the choice of how public I wanted this revelation to be. I thought about the past hour of humiliation, the years of condescension, the countless family gatherings where I'd been made to feel like a disappointment. Part of me wanted to take Henrik somewhere private, to spare my sisters the embarrassment of discovering they'd been wrong about me. But another part of me, a part that had been buried under years of trying to keep the peace, wanted them to hear whatever he had to say. They can hear it, I said quietly. We're family. Henrik nodded and followed me back into the dining room, where conversation died the moment we appeared. He waited politely while I reclaimed my seat, then addressed the entire table with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to delivering significant news to groups of people. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for interrupting your family gathering. My name is Henrik Larsson, and I represent the First International Bank of Zurich in Switzerland. I'm here because of a matter that has been pending for several months now, concerning the estate of Martha Rodriguez Steinberg, and a specific bequest to Miss Emma Rodriguez. Uncle Robert leaned forward with obvious interest. Martha never mentioned anything about having money in Switzerland. Are you sure you have the right family? His skepticism was understandable, given what we all thought we knew about Martha's modest lifestyle and simple cottage in Wisconsin. I am quite certain, Henrik replied smoothly. Mrs. Rodriguez Steinberg maintained accounts with our institution from 1963 until her death last year. She was, by any measure, a woman of considerable means. However, she chose to live very quietly in her final years, and she was quite specific about how her estate should be handled upon her death. Amanda set down her wineglass with deliberate precision. When you say considerable means, what exactly are we talking about? Her investment banker instincts had clearly kicked in, and I could see her calculating potential figures in her head, probably wondering why this windfall hadn't appeared in the will reading we'd all attended. Henrik's eyes moved to the music box, which Amanda was still holding like it might suddenly reveal hidden treasures. The specific amount is something I'll need to discuss with Miss Rodriguez privately, but I can tell you that your great-aunt's estate extends far beyond what was distributed through her American will. The music box that Miss Rodriguez inherited is not simply a sentimental keepsake. It contains the access mechanism to accounts that have been accumulating interest for over 60 years. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the heating system humming through the hotel's vents. Jessica's fork was suspended halfway to her mouth. Amanda had gone completely still, and Uncle Robert was staring at me like I'd suddenly sprouted wings. I felt like I was watching the scene from outside my own body, unable to quite believe that this conversation was actually happening. Access mechanism? I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. What do you mean? Henrik gestured gently toward the music box. May I? Amanda handed it over reluctantly, clearly unwilling to let go of what might suddenly be the most valuable item in the room. Henrik examined it carefully, running his fingers along the base until he found something that made him nod with satisfaction. Your great-aunt was quite ingenious. She never trusted traditional banks entirely, having lived through the financial upheavals of the mid-20th century. The mechanism that opens this music box has been modified to contain a very specific key sequence. He opened the lid, and those two familiar notes played their broken melody. But instead of stopping there, Henrik reached inside and pressed something near the back corner of the interior. Suddenly, a small panel in the base slid open, revealing a cavity that none of us had ever noticed. Inside was a tiny metal cylinder, no bigger than a pencil eraser, engraved with numbers and symbols that meant nothing to me but clearly meant everything to Henrik. This, he said, holding up the cylinder with reverence, is the access key to account number CH77392847196 EMR at the First International Bank of Zurich. The account was established in 1963 with an initial deposit, and your great-aunt continued to make substantial contributions throughout her 30 years in Switzerland. She also provided very specific instructions about who could access the account and under what circumstances. I stared at the tiny metal object that had been hiding inside the music box all these months, sitting on my nightstand like a silent guardian of secrets I never could have imagined. "What kind of instructions?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I was ready for the answer. "The account can only be accessed by the person who inherits this specific music box, and only if they demonstrate the same values that guided your great-aunt's life." She was quite specific that the heir must be someone who chose to help others over personal gain, someone who understood that true wealth comes from making the world better, not from accumulating possessions. Henrik paused, studying my face carefully. "Your great-aunt followed your career choices closely, Miss Rodriguez. She was particularly impressed by your decision to pursue social work instead of a more lucrative profession, despite the disapproval of your family." The words hit me like a physical blow. Martha had known about my family's disapproval. She'd been watching from afar as I struggled to justify my choices to people who saw my work as a failure. The idea that someone had understood and supported my decisions, even from a distance, was almost overwhelming. Jessica found her voice first, though it came out strained and higher than usual. "How much money are we talking about here?" Her legal training had clearly kicked in, and she was trying to maintain some semblance of control over a situation that was rapidly spinning beyond her comprehension. Henrik looked at me rather than Jessica when he answered. "Miss Rodriguez, your great-aunt's account currently holds approximately $80 million in various currencies and investments. She also owns significant real estate holdings in Switzerland and other European countries, which brings the total estate value to just over $120 million. The dining room went so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Amanda's face had gone completely white, Jessica was gripping her napkin like a lifeline, and Uncle Robert looked like he might faint. I felt like I was floating above the scene, watching someone else's life unfold in front of me. $80 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, like discussing the distance between planets or the age of the universe. "That's impossible," Amanda whispered, finally finding her voice. "People don't just hide that kind of money in music boxes. There has to be some mistake." Her investment background had clearly taught her to be skeptical of anything that seemed too good to be true, and this definitely qualified. Henrik reached into his briefcase and withdrew a leather portfolio thick with documents. "I have all the necessary paperwork here, including copies of the account statements, real estate deeds, and your great-aunt's detailed instructions for the transfer of assets. Everything has been maintained in accordance with Swiss banking laws and international estate regulations. Ms. Rodriguez, this inheritance is quite real and quite legal." I accepted the portfolio with hands that felt disconnected from my body, flipping through pages of financial statements that showed numbers with more zeros than I'd ever seen outside of textbooks. There were property deeds for chalets in the Swiss Alps, investment summaries for stocks and bonds I'd never heard of, and page after page of documentation that proved Henrik Larsen was telling the truth. Martha had been not just wealthy but extraordinarily wealthy, and she'd left it all to me. "Why?" I asked, the word coming out as barely more than a breath. "Why me? Why not someone who actually knew what to do with this kind of money?" I gestured toward my sisters, both of whom were staring at the documents in my hands with expressions I'd never seen before. "Jessica and Amanda understand finance and business. I organize food drives and teach kids to read." Henrik's smile was gentle and understanding. "Miss Rodriguez, your great-aunt spent considerable time researching each of her great-nieces and great-nephews before making her decision. She felt that giving such wealth to someone who already prioritized money over people would simply amplify their existing tendencies. She wanted her legacy to go to someone who would use it wisely, someone who understood that money is a tool for helping others, not an end in itself." He paused, glancing around the table at my family's stunned faces. She also left very specific instructions about how the inheritance should be revealed. She wanted it to happen in the presence of the family members who had spent years underestimating the inheritor, because she felt it was important for everyone to understand that success comes in many forms, and that true worth cannot be measured by conventional standards. The implication of his words sank in slowly. Martha hadn't just left me her fortune, she'd orchestrated this entire revelation to happen exactly as it had. She'd known that my family would mock the music box, that they would see it as proof of my lesser status within the family hierarchy. She'd planned for this moment, when the truth would rewrite everything they thought they knew about me and about her. Jessica was the first to recover from the shock, her lawyer instincts kicking in as she tried to regain some control over the situation. Mr. Larson, I'm sure you understand that this is quite a lot to process. Perhaps we should arrange for a more private meeting to discuss the details and ensure that everything is handled properly. Her tone was carefully professional, but I could hear the desperation underneath it, the need to insert herself into a situation where she'd suddenly become irrelevant. Of course, Henrik replied politely. However, the initial transfer of access can only be completed with Miss Rodriguez alone, as per the specific terms of the bequest. She will need to visit our Chicago office tomorrow to complete the necessary paperwork and establish her access to the accounts. He turned back to me with an expression that was both respectful and expectant. Miss Rodriguez, do you have any questions about your inheritance or the process for claiming it? I stared at him, then at the portfolio in my hands, then at my family's faces around the table. Questions? I had thousands of questions. I had so many questions, I didn't even know where to begin asking them. But the biggest question, the one that seemed to matter most in this moment, was one I was afraid to voice out loud. What was I supposed to do with $80 million when I'd spent my entire adult life believing that my worth as a person had nothing to do with money? Is there any restriction on how I can use the money? I asked finally. Any requirements about what I have to do with it? Part of me was terrified that there would be strings attached, conditions that would force me to abandon the work I loved or become someone I didn't recognize. Henrik shook his head. Your great-aunt believed that if she chose the right person, no restrictions would be necessary. The money is yours to use as you see fit. She trusted that someone who had dedicated their life to helping others would continue to do so, perhaps with greater resources than before. He closed his briefcase and stood, preparing to leave us to process what had just happened. I'll expect you at our office tomorrow at 10 a.m., Miss Rodriguez. The address is in the portfolio. After he left, the dining room remained silent for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. I sat there holding the portfolio and the music box, trying to absorb the fact that my life had just changed in ways I couldn't even begin to comprehend. $80 million. The number kept circling through my mind like a song I couldn't stop humming. Impossible to ignore, but equally impossible to fully understand. Amanda was the first to speak, her voice carefully controlled. Emma, you realize this changes everything, right? You're going to need financial advisors, tax attorneys, investment managers. This isn't something you can handle on your own. Her offer of help came with an undertone that suggested she might be the perfect person to provide such guidance, despite having just spent the evening mocking my life choices. Jessica nodded eagerly. Amanda's right. This kind of inheritance comes with serious legal implications. You'll need someone who understands estate law, international finance, tax obligations. I could represent you, make sure everything is handled properly. The subtext was clear. They wanted to be involved, to insert themselves into my windfall, and presumably benefit from it in whatever way they could manage. I looked at them both. These sisters who had spent years making me feel like a failure, who had mocked my inheritance just an hour earlier, who were now desperately trying to position themselves as indispensable to my future. The old Emma, the one who had spent years trying to please them and win their approval, might have immediately agreed to their help. But something had shifted in the past hour, and it wasn't just the discovery of Martha's fortune. I think I need some time to process this, I said quietly, standing up from the table with the portfolio clutched against my chest. This has been a lot to take in. I looked around the table at my extended family, all of whom were watching me with expressions ranging from shock to calculation to barely concealed envy. I should go home and try to understand what just happened. Uncle Robert stood as well, his face flushed with excitement and possibility. Emma, honey, I hope you know that family sticks together through times like this. We've always supported you, and we want to make sure you're taken care of. His revisionist history was so blatant it was almost amusing, but I was too emotionally exhausted to call him out on it. Of course, I replied non-committally, gathering my purse and coat. Thank you all for a memorable evening. The irony in my words was lost on exactly no one. but they let me leave without further attempts to insert themselves into my newfound fortune. The drive home through Chicago's winter streets gave me time to start processing what had just happened, though I suspected it would take much longer than a 20-minute car ride to fully absorb the magnitude of the change in my circumstances. $80 million. The number was so large it felt fictional, like something from a movie rather than my actual life. I'd gone from worrying about my rent to being wealthier than most celebrities, all because of a music box that everyone had considered worthless. But as I sat in my small apartment that night, staring at the portfolio of documents that proved my new reality, I realized that the money, while shocking, wasn't the most significant thing that had happened that evening. What mattered more was the revelation that Martha had been watching, that she'd understood and approved of my choices, that she'd seen value in a path my family had dismissed as failure. For the first time in years, I felt like someone in my family had truly seen me for who I was, rather than who they thought I should be. The music box sat on my coffee table, its hidden compartment now empty but somehow more beautiful than it had ever appeared before. Those two broken notes that had seemed so pathetic earlier now sounded like the beginning of a symphony I was only just learning to hear. Sleep eluded me completely that night. I lay in my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while the numbers swirled through my consciousness like a fever dream. $80 million. $120 million total. The figures were so astronomical they felt like abstract concepts, rather than actual amounts of money that now belonged to me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Henrik Larsson's calm face delivering impossible news, or Jessica's expression of shocked disbelief, or that tiny metal cylinder emerging from the music box like something from a fairy tale. By morning, I'd convinced myself at least 3 times that the entire evening had been an elaborate hallucination brought on by stress and too much exposure to my family's condescension. But the portfolio of documents sat on my kitchen table next to my coffee mug, thick with official seals and signatures that proved everything had actually happened. The music box rested beside it, its secret compartment now open and empty, transformed overnight from a source of embarrassment into the most significant object I'd ever owned. My phone had been buzzing incessantly since 7 a.m. Jessica had called 4 times, Amanda 6, and Uncle Robert had left 3 voicemails that I hadn't bothered listening to yet. The sudden surge in family interest would have been amusing if it weren't so transparently motivated by dollar signs. These were the same people who had barely remembered my birthday for the past 5 years, who had treated my presence at family gatherings like an obligation they were forced to endure. Now they couldn't reach me fast enough. I dressed carefully for my appointment with Henrik Larsson, choosing my best professional outfit, a navy blazer and matching skirt that I'd worn to job interviews and important community center meetings. Looking at myself in the mirror, I tried to see what Martha had seen in me, what had convinced her that I was the right person to inherit a fortune that could change thousands of lives. All I saw was the same woman who had been mocked at dinner parties and pitied at holiday gatherings, someone who had never owned anything more valuable than her 10-year-old Honda Civic. The First International Bank of Zurich's Chicago office occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown tower, all marble columns and brass fixtures that spoke of old money and older traditions. Henrik Larsson met me in the lobby personally, greeting me with the same quiet dignity he'd shown the night before, as if transforming ordinary people into millionaires was simply part of his daily routine. "Miss Rodriguez," he said, shaking my hand warmly, "I trust you were able to get some rest despite the evening's revelations?" His slight smile suggested he understood exactly how impossible sleep would have been after learning about such a massive inheritance. "Not really," I admitted as we walked toward the elevator. "I keep expecting to wake up and find out this was all some elaborate dream." The elevator doors closed behind us with a soft whisper, carrying us toward the 32nd floor, and a reality I still couldn't quite grasp. Henrik's office was exactly what I would have imagined for a Swiss banker. Understated elegance with leather-bound books, Persian rugs, and a view of Lake Michigan that probably cost more per month than my annual salary. He gestured for me to sit in one of 2 chairs facing his massive mahogany desk, then settled across from me with a folder even thicker than the portfolio he'd given me the night before. "Before we begin the formal transfer process," he said, opening the folder with practiced precision, I think it would be helpful for you to understand more about your great-aunt's remarkable life and how she accumulated such wealth. Martha Rodriguez Steinberg was quite an extraordinary woman, and her story might help you understand why she chose you as her heir. He withdrew a black and white photograph and placed it on the desk between us. The image showed a young woman in her 20s, dark-haired and serious-eyed, standing in front of what appeared to be a European train station. She wore a simple dress and carried a single suitcase, but there was something in her posture that suggested determination and intelligence beyond her years. This was taken in 1963, when your great-aunt first arrived in Switzerland, Henrik explained. She was 24 years old, spoke almost no German or French, and had exactly $200 to her name. She'd left Chicago after a family scandal involving her engagement to a man her parents considered unsuitable. Rather than submit to an arranged marriage with someone she didn't love, she chose to forge her own path in a foreign country where she knew no one. The photograph captivated me. I could see traces of the Martha I remembered in the young woman's face, but this version radiated a confidence and determination that the elderly recluse had hidden completely. What did she do when she got there? I asked, studying the image more closely. Initially, she worked as a translator for American businesses expanding into European markets, Henrik replied, producing more documents from the folder. Her bilingual abilities and understanding of American business culture made her invaluable to companies trying to navigate Swiss banking and investment laws. Within 5 years, she'd saved enough money to start her own consulting firm, helping American investors understand European opportunities and European companies access American markets. He showed me incorporation papers, client lists, and financial statements that told the story of a woman who had built an empire through intelligence, hard work, and an uncanny ability to understand international finance. By 1970, Martha's consulting firm was handling millions of dollars in cross-border transactions. By 1980, she was investing her own money in real estate, stocks, and emerging technologies that would prove incredibly lucrative over the following decades. She was particularly prescient about technology investments, Henrik continued, showing me portfolio statements from the 1980s and 1990s. She bought significant stakes in companies that would later become Microsoft, Apple, and Google, often when they were still considered risky startups. She also invested heavily in Swiss real estate during periods when property values were depressed, then held those investments for decades as they appreciated exponentially. The numbers on the statements were staggering. What had started as a few $1,000s in the 1960s had grown through careful investment and compound interest into tens of millions by the 1990s. Martha hadn't just been wealthy. She'd been a financial genius who had anticipated market trends and technological shifts with remarkable accuracy. Why did she never tell the family about any of this? I asked, trying to reconcile the image of this brilliant businesswoman with the quiet, almost invisible great-aunt I remembered. We all thought she was just getting by on some small pension. Henrik's expression grew thoughtful. Your great-aunt was deeply hurt by her family's reaction to her decision to leave Chicago. They viewed her choices as scandalous and irresponsible, and they essentially disowned her for refusing to conform to their expectations. She told me that the experience taught her the difference between people who loved her for who she was, and people who only valued her when she met their standards. The parallel to my own experience wasn't lost on me. Martha had been the family disappointment in her generation, just as I had become in mine. She'd chosen love over security, independence over conformity, and had been rejected by people who should have supported her. The difference was that she'd had the courage to leave and build something extraordinary, while I'd stayed and tried to prove my worth to people who refused to see it. She followed all of your lives from afar, Henrik continued, withdrawing a file labeled with my name. She kept newspaper clippings about Jessica's legal career and Amanda's banking achievements, but she also collected information about your work at the community center. She had copies of articles from local papers about your youth programs, letters of recommendation you'd written for scholarship applicants, and reports about the families your organization had helped. He opened the file to reveal dozens of documents I'd never known existed. There were photographs of me at community events, copies of grant applications I'd written, and even testimonials from clients and colleagues about the impact of my work. Martha had been documenting my career as carefully as any proud parent or grandparent, building a record of achievements that my own family had never bothered to notice. She was particularly moved by this, Henrik said, producing a letter on community center letterhead. It was a thank you note from Maria Santos, a single mother whose son had been struggling in school until he'd joined our after-school tutoring program. The letter described how I'd worked with the boy personally, staying late to help him with homework, and eventually helping him raise his grades enough to qualify for a scholarship to a private high school. Your great-aunt felt that this letter demonstrated exactly the kind of character she hoped to find in her heir, Henrik explained. Someone who would go above and beyond to help others, even when no one was watching or keeping score. She believed that true wealth meant having the resources to make a meaningful difference in the world, and she wanted to ensure her money went to someone who would use it for that purpose. I stared at the letter, remembering Maria Santos and her son Carlos, who was now in his second year of college studying engineering. I'd never thought of helping him as anything extraordinary. It was simply what the situation had required. But seeing it through Martha's eyes, understanding that she'd viewed my small acts of service as evidence of something larger, made me feel like I was seeing myself clearly for the first time in years. She also left specific instructions about how she wanted you to approach this inheritance, Henrik continued, producing a sealed envelope with my name written in Martha's careful handwriting. She asked that I give this to you after you'd learned about the money, but before you made any major decisions about how to use it. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope, revealing several pages of Martha's distinctive script. The letter was dated just 6 months before her death, and reading it felt like having a conversation with the aunt I'd never really known but who had apparently known me better than I'd known myself. My dear Emma, the letter began, if you are reading this, then Henrik has successfully completed the task I set for him, and you now know the truth about both my life and your inheritance. I imagine you are feeling overwhelmed, perhaps even frightened by the responsibility that has suddenly fallen to you. That reaction tells me I chose correctly. The letter went on to describe Martha's own fears when her consulting business had first become successful, her uncertainty about whether she deserved the wealth she was accumulating, and her gradual understanding that money was simply a tool that could be used for good or ill depending on the character of the person wielding it. I have watched you choose service over comfort, meaning over money, and compassion over success as your family defines it, Martha had written. These choices have made you exactly the kind of person who can handle great wealth without being corrupted by it. You have already proven that your values cannot be bought or sold. Now you will have the resources to live those values on a scale you never imagined possible. The letter included specific suggestions about financial advisors she trusted, charitable organizations she'd researched, and investment strategies that aligned with ethical principles. But more than practical advice, it offered something I'd been searching for my entire adult life. Validation that my choices had been right. That choosing to help others over pursuing conventional success had been not just acceptable, but admirable. She also wanted you to know, Henrik said as I finished reading, that she never married or had children because she never found someone who understood that true partnership meant supporting each other's dreams, rather than trying to reshape them. She felt that your family's inability to appreciate your choices said more about their limitations than yours. I folded the letter carefully, feeling like I was holding something more precious than any bank statement or property deed. For years I'd wondered if I was deluding myself, if my sisters were right that I was wasting my potential on work that didn't matter. Martha's words offered a different perspective, one that valued character over credentials and impact over income. Now, Henrik said, pulling out a series of forms and documents, we need to complete the formal transfer process. This will give you full access to all accounts and properties, as well as establishing you as the legal owner of your great-aunt's estate. Do you have any questions before we proceed? I stared at the papers that would make me one of the wealthiest people in Chicago, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. What happens if I make mistakes? I asked. What if I'm not smart enough to handle this kind of money responsibly? Henrik smiled, the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen from him since we'd met. Miss Rodriguez, your great-aunt anticipated that exact concern. She established a trust structure that will provide you with expert guidance while preserving your ultimate authority over how the money is used. You'll work with a team of financial advisors, but the final decisions will always be yours. He explained the structure Martha had created. A board of advisors including himself, a financial planner, a tax attorney, and a philanthropic consultant who specialized in helping wealthy individuals direct their charitable giving effectively. They would provide guidance and expertise, but I would remain in complete control of all decisions regarding investments, expenditures, and donations. Your great-aunt also suggested that you might want to continue working at the community center, at least initially, Henrik added. She felt that maintaining your connection to the work you love would help ensure that you never lose sight of why this inheritance matters. The money should enhance your ability to help others, not replace your desire to do so. The suggestion resonated deeply with me. The idea of walking away from the Garfield Community Center, from the families and children who depended on our programs, felt wrong, despite the newfound resources at my disposal. My work there wasn't just a job. It was a calling that had shaped who I was as a person. Martha's wealth could amplify that impact exponentially, but it shouldn't replace the hands-on service that gave my life meaning. We spent the next 2 hours completing paperwork, transferring accounts, and establishing my access to funds that would allow me to live comfortably for several lifetimes. By the time we finished, I had immediate access to more money than I'd earned in my entire career, with the vast majority of the inheritance structured in long-term investments that would continue growing for decades to come. There is one more thing, Henrik said as we prepared to conclude our meeting. Your great-aunt specified that the initial revelation of this inheritance should happen in the presence of family members who had underestimated you. She felt it was important for them to understand that success cannot always be measured by conventional standards. However, she also hoped that this experience might ultimately strengthen your family relationships rather than damage them. I thought about the phone calls I'd been ignoring all morning, the sudden surge of interest from sisters who had spent years treating me like a burden. I'm not sure they're interested in a stronger relationship, I said honestly. I think they're more interested in access to the money. Perhaps, Henrik replied diplomatically, but people sometimes surprise us when their worldview is challenged dramatically enough. Your great-aunt believed that seeing your success might force them to reconsider their assumptions about what truly matters in life. She hoped they might learn to value you for who you are rather than what you have. The optimism in his words was touching, but I wasn't sure I shared it. My sisters had spent so many years defining themselves in opposition to my choices that I doubted even $80 million could change their fundamental perspective on success and worth. Still, Martha's faith in the possibility of family reconciliation was yet another gift she'd given me, even if I wasn't ready to unwrap it yet. As I left the bank that afternoon, carrying documents that proved my new status as one of Chicago's wealthiest residents, I felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and terror. The money would allow me to expand the community center's programs exponentially, to fund scholarships for dozens of students like Carlos Santos, to address problems I'd only been able to treat around the margins before. But it would also change every relationship in my life, starting with my family and extending to friends and colleagues who would inevitably view me differently once they learned about my inheritance. The drive back to my apartment gave me time to consider my next steps. I needed to decide how much to tell my coworkers, how to handle the inevitable media attention that might accompany such a large inheritance, and most importantly, how to respond to the family members who were suddenly so eager to reconnect with me. The phone calls from Jessica and Amanda had continued throughout my meeting with Henrik, along with several voicemails that I suspected contained offers of help that were really requests for access to my newfound wealth. But first, I needed to return to the community center and finish the workday I'd started that morning. Whatever else had changed, the after-school program still needed supervision, the food distribution still required coordination, and the families we served still needed the services that had brought meaning to my life, long before I'd learned about Swiss bank accounts and real estate investments. As I walked into the familiar chaos of children arriving for tutoring and parents picking up emergency food supplies, I felt the same sense of purpose that had guided me for the past 5 years. The difference now was that I had the resources to expand that purpose beyond anything I'd previously imagined possible. Martha's gift wasn't just money. It was the opportunity to prove that wealth could be a force for good when placed in the hands of someone who understood that true success meant lifting others up, rather than climbing over them. The music box sat on my desk at home that evening, no longer playing its broken melody, but somehow more beautiful in its silence. It had been the key to unlocking not just a fortune, but a deeper understanding of my own worth and potential. Martha had seen something in me that my family had missed. Something that couldn't be measured in salary figures or professional titles. Now I had the chance to prove that her faith in me was justified, and to use her legacy to create the kind of change she would have applauded. The confrontation I'd been dreading came 3 days later, not through the phone calls I'd been avoiding, but through an unexpected visit to the community center. I was helping 8-year-old Marcus Thompson with his reading homework when our receptionist knocked on the door of the tutoring room. "Emma, there are some people here to see you. They say they're your sisters." Through the glass partition that separated the tutoring area from the main lobby, I could see Jessica and Amanda standing near the reception desk like exotic birds that had accidentally flown into the wrong habitat. Jessica wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than our monthly utility budget, while Amanda clutched a designer handbag and looked around the community center with the kind of expression someone might wear when visiting a foreign country where they didn't speak the language. "Can you finish this page on your own, Marcus?" I asked, placing the book gently in front of him. "I'll be back in a few minutes." The boy nodded solemnly, already absorbed in the story about a young detective solving mysteries in his neighborhood. His concentration reminded me why I loved this work so much, why no amount of money could replace the satisfaction of watching a child discover the joy of learning. My sisters turned as I approached, and for a moment, I saw something in their faces that I'd never witnessed before. Uncertainty. These were women who commanded boardrooms and negotiated million-dollar deals, but standing in the community center where I'd found my purpose, they looked as lost as I'd felt at their corporate networking events. "Emma," Jessica said, her voice carrying a forced brightness that didn't reach her eyes, "we thought we'd stop by and see where you work. It's quite impressive." She gestured vaguely at the children's artwork covering the walls, the mismatched furniture donated by various community members, and the organized chaos that characterized any space where dozens of families sought help every day. Amanda nodded enthusiastically, though her smile seemed frozen in place. "We realized we've never actually visited you here. After the other night, we thought it was time we saw what you've been building." Her use of the word building was deliberate, I suspected, an attempt to frame my work in terms they could understand and respect. "Would you like a tour?" I offered, though I wasn't sure they actually wanted to see more of the community center, or if they were simply going through motions they felt were now required, given my changed circumstances. "We've got about an hour before the evening programs start." I led them through the main floor, explaining the various programs we offered. The food pantry that served over 200 families monthly, the computer lab where seniors learned to navigate digital services, the childcare program that allowed single parents to attend job training classes, and the homework help sessions that had become one of our most popular offerings. Jessica and Amanda followed politely, asking questions that sounded genuine but felt rehearsed, as if they'd prepared for this visit the same way they might prepare for a client presentation. "How many people work here?" Amanda asked as we passed the office, where our 3 full-time staff members were coordinating weekend volunteer schedules. Her investment banking background had clearly kicked in, and I could see her mentally calculating operational costs and efficiency metrics. 12 staff members total, plus about 40 regular volunteers, I replied. "We serve roughly 800 families directly, but our impact reaches much further when you consider family members, extended networks, and the ripple effects of the programs we provide." I'd given this explanation so many times to potential funders that the numbers rolled off my tongue automatically, but saying them in front of my sisters felt different, like I was finally able to demonstrate the scope of work they'd dismissed as insignificant. Jessica paused in front of a bulletin board covered with thank you letters from program participants, success stories, and photos from community events. "This woman says you helped her get her GED and find a job that doubled her income," she said, reading one of the letters aloud. "That's quite an achievement." There was something in her tone that suggested genuine surprise, as if she'd never considered that my work might produce measurable, life-changing results. "Maria Gonzalez," I said, recognizing the letter without needing to read it, She's now managing a retail store and saving money to buy a house. Her daughter Sophia is in high school and wants to become a teacher. I could have told them dozens of similar stories, but I sensed they were still processing the idea that my supposedly meaningless job had generated real success stories of its own. We ended the tour in my small office, where Amanda immediately noticed the music box sitting on my desk beside a stack of grant applications. "You brought it to work?" she asked, gesturing toward the object that had started this entire upheaval. "Aren't you worried someone might steal it, knowing what it's worth?" "The value was never in the box itself," I replied, settling into my desk chair while they remained standing, clearly uncomfortable in the cramped space. It was in what Martha wanted me to understand about worth and inheritance and choosing the right person to trust with important things. The parallel wasn't subtle, but I wasn't in the mood for subtlety given the reason for their visit. Jessica exchanged a look with Amanda, one of those silent sister communications that had always made me feel excluded from their inner circle. Then Jessica took a deep breath and launched into what was clearly a prepared speech. "Emma, we owe you an apology. We've spent years misunderstanding what you were doing here, and we're sorry for that. We can see now that your work has real impact, real value that goes beyond financial measurements." "The other night was embarrassing for all of us," Amanda added quickly. "We said things about your inheritance that were cruel and short-sighted. We should have supported you instead of mocking something we didn't understand." Her apology sounded sincere, but there was an undertone that suggested she was working towards something larger than simple contrition. I waited for them to continue, suspecting that apologies were just the opening act for whatever request was coming next. My sisters had never been the type to make social visits without specific objectives, and their sudden interest in my workplace felt too convenient to be entirely altruistic. Jessica cleared her throat and moved into what I recognized as her closing argument voice. "The thing is, Emma, we've been thinking about your situation and the opportunities this inheritance creates, not just for you, but for our entire family. This kind of wealth comes with responsibilities and challenges that require careful planning and professional expertise." She gestured around my office, as if the modest space proved her point about my need for guidance. "What Jessica means," Amanda interjected, "is that we want to help you manage this transition. I have extensive experience with large-scale investments and wealth management. Jessica understands the legal complexities of estate planning and tax implications. We could form a kind of family advisory board to make sure you're making the best possible decisions." There it was. The real reason for their visit, the offer I'd been expecting since Henrik Larsson had first mentioned the $80 million. They wanted to insert themselves into my inheritance, to become indispensable advisors who could benefit from proximity to wealth they hadn't earned but felt entitled to influence. "I appreciate the offer," I said carefully, "but Martha actually established a comprehensive support structure before she died. I'll be working with Henrik Larsson and a team of specialists she selected specifically for their expertise and ethical standards." I watched their faces fall slightly as they realized their services might not be needed after all. "But those are strangers," Jessica protested. "We're family. We understand your background, your personality, your long-term goals, in ways that no outside advisor ever could." Her argument might have been more compelling if she'd demonstrated any understanding of my goals during the years when I actually needed family support. Amanda leaned forward, her voice taking on the persuasive tone she probably used with reluctant investors. "Emma, I know we haven't always been as supportive as we should have been, but this inheritance changes everything. We want to be part of your success, to help you build something even bigger than what Martha created. Imagine what we could accomplish working together." The irony was almost overwhelming. For years, they'd treated my community work as a hobby, a phase one would eventually outgrow when I came to my senses and pursued real success. Now they wanted to collaborate, to be part of building something bigger, but only after money had entered the equation. Their interest in my goals was entirely dependent on their potential to benefit from them. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "How do you envision this family collaboration working?" Jessica's eyes lit up, suggesting she'd been waiting for this opening. "Well, you could establish a foundation to formalize your charitable work, with Amanda managing the investment portfolio and me handling the legal structure. We could expand your programs exponentially, Maybe even franchise the community center model to other cities. With our business expertise and your operational knowledge, we could create something truly revolutionary. You'd be the public face, the heart of the operation, Amanda added eagerly. We'd handle the behind-the-scenes work that you don't have experience with yet. It would be a true partnership, combining all our strengths to maximize impact. Her pitch was polished and professionally delivered, but it felt more like a business proposal than a family conversation. I studied their faces, these sisters who had spent years making me feel inadequate and were now eager to become my partners in philanthropy. Part of me was tempted by their offer, seduced by the possibility of finally working together, instead of being constantly compared and found wanting. But another part of me, the part that had been strengthened by Martha's letter and Henrik's guidance, recognized this for what it really was, an attempt to position themselves as gatekeepers to my inheritance. Let me ask you something, I said quietly. If Henrik Larsson hadn't walked into that hotel dining room, if I'd never inherited anything from Martha, would you be here right now? Would you have ever visited the community center or shown interest in my work? The question hung in the air between us like smoke from an extinguished candle. Amanda shifted uncomfortably in her chair. That's not fair, Emma. We've always cared about you, even if we didn't always express it properly. This inheritance just gives us a chance to show that support in a more meaningful way. Her deflection was skillful, but it didn't answer my question. You're our sister, Jessica added. Of course we want to be involved in your success. Family supports family, especially during major life transitions like this. The selective application of family loyalty wasn't lost on me, given how little support they'd offered during my actual major life transitions. Choosing social work over law school, starting my career at the community center, struggling financially while building something meaningful. I looked at both of them, these accomplished women who had never lacked for confidence or resources, who were now asking me to share something they'd played no role in creating. For the first time in our relationship, I held all the power, and they were the ones seeking my approval and inclusion. I understand why you'd want to be involved, I said finally. But I need to be honest about something. Martha specifically chose me because of the work I was already doing, the values I'd already demonstrated, and the path I'd chosen despite family pressure to do something else. She trusted me to continue being the person who had earned her respect, not to become someone different just because I now had access to her money. Jessica's expression tightened slightly. We're not asking you to become someone different. We're asking you to think bigger, to use this opportunity to expand your impact beyond what you could accomplish alone. Her lawyer instincts had kicked in, and she was arguing her case with the same intensity she brought to closing real estate deals. But that's exactly what I plan to do, I replied. I'm going to expand these programs, fund new initiatives, and help more families than I ever could before. The difference is that I'm going to do it in ways that align with Martha's values and maintain the integrity of what we've built here. I'm going to work with advisors who understand philanthropy, not just wealth management. Amanda leaned back in her chair, clearly frustrated by my resistance to their proposal. Emma, I think you're making a mistake by excluding family from such important decisions. We have expertise that could benefit your goals, and we have a vested interest in your success that outsiders will never share. Her argument was logical from a business perspective, but it ignored the emotional reality of our relationship history. Do you? I asked quietly. Do you have a vested interest in my success? Or do you have a vested interest in accessing the benefits that come with my success? The distinction was crucial, and their inability to acknowledge it told me everything I needed to know about their motivations. The silence that followed was uncomfortable but necessary. For years, I'd avoided confronting the dynamics that had made family gatherings so painful, the subtle ways they'd diminished my choices while elevating their own. But Martha's inheritance had given me something more valuable than money, the confidence to speak honestly about relationships that had never been as mutual or supportive as they claimed. Jessica was the first to break the silence, her voice carrying a defensive edge. I think you're being unfair, Emma. We're trying to reach out, to build bridges, and you're treating us like we have ulterior motives. Her accusation might have made me doubt myself in the past, but I'd spent too many years being made to feel guilty for setting boundaries. I'm being realistic, I replied calmly. You spent Tuesday evening mocking the music box that contained access to $80 million. You've spent years treating my work here like a temporary hobby that I'd eventually outgrow. Now you want to become my business partners. And you're surprised that I'm hesitant to trust that this sudden change of heart is entirely about supporting my goals? Amanda's face flushed with what looked like genuine embarrassment. We made mistakes, Emma. We misjudged your work and your inheritance, and we're trying to make up for that. But punishing us forever won't help anyone, including the people you want to serve through your programs. Her appeal was emotionally manipulative, but not entirely wrong, which made it harder to dismiss completely. I considered her words carefully, trying to separate my legitimate concerns about their motives from any desire for revenge or vindication. Martha's letter had emphasized forgiveness and family healing, but it had also stressed the importance of surrounding myself with people who shared my values and commitment to helping others. I'm not trying to punish anyone, I said finally, but I am trying to honor Martha's trust by making decisions based on what's best for the communities we serve, not what's most comfortable for our family relationships. If you want to be involved in this work, if you genuinely care about expanding these programs and helping more families, then prove it. Volunteer here. Get to know our clients and understand their needs. Show me that your interest extends beyond managing the money. Jessica exchanged another look with Amanda, and I could see them calculating whether my proposal was worth their time and effort. The fact that they needed to consider it, that volunteering at the community center wasn't an obviously appealing opportunity, told me everything about the gap between their stated intentions and their actual priorities. Of course we'd be willing to volunteer, Amanda said after a pause that lasted just a bit too long. We want to understand your work better and contribute however we can. Her agreement sounded dutiful rather than enthusiastic, like someone accepting an unpleasant but necessary task. That would be wonderful, I replied, though I suspected their volunteer commitment would last about as long as their initial excitement about being my financial advisors. I'll have our volunteer coordinator reach out to you next week to discuss scheduling and training. We always need help with literacy tutoring, career counseling, and administrative support. The conversation wound down after that, with promises to stay in touch and vague commitments to family dinners that would presumably be less dramatic than our last gathering. As I walked them to their cars, I noticed how out of place they looked among the families arriving for evening programs, how their expensive clothes and careful makeup contrasted with the practical attire of parents juggling multiple jobs and young children. After they left, I returned to the tutoring room where Marcus Thompson was still working on his reading assignment, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration as he sounded out difficult words. "How's it going, Marcus?" I asked, settling back into the chair beside him. "Good," he said without looking up from the page. "This detective is really smart." He figured out that the missing cat was hiding in the old lady's garden shed. His excitement about the story reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this work in the first place, why no amount of family drama or financial windfall could diminish the satisfaction of helping a child discover new worlds through reading. "That's excellent detective work by both of you," I said, and Marcus beamed with pride. In that moment, surrounded by the familiar sounds of children learning and families finding support, I felt more confident than ever that I'd made the right choice about my inheritance and my future. Over the following weeks, I began implementing the expansion plans that Martha's inheritance made possible. Working with Henrik Larsson and the advisory team she'd established, I created a foundation that would fund new programs while maintaining the community-centered approach that had always guided my work. We expanded the food pantry, hired additional staff, and launched a scholarship program for high school students pursuing higher education. Jessica and Amanda did complete volunteer training and began helping with administrative tasks and career counseling sessions. Their participation was sporadic and clearly outside their comfort zones, but they made genuine efforts to understand the families we served and the challenges our programs addressed. Whether their involvement would last remained to be seen, but their willingness to try represented more progress than I'd expected. The most satisfying moment came 3 months after that evening at the Palmer House Hotel, when Carlos Santos, the young man I'd helped years earlier, returned to the community center as a college sophomore studying social work. He wanted to volunteer during his winter break, he said, to give back to the program that had changed his life's trajectory. "Miss Emma," he said as I showed him around the expanded facilities, "my mom told me you inherited a lot of money. Are you going to stop working here?" His concern was genuine, reflecting the anxiety many of our clients felt about whether success would take me away from the community that had given my life meaning. "No, Carlos," I replied, watching him interact with current students who reminded me of his younger self. "This is exactly where I belong. The money just means we can help more families and students like you." His relief was visible, and in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that Martha had chosen correctly. The music box still sits on my desk at the community center, no longer playing its broken melody but serving as a daily reminder of the unexpected ways life can change when we remain true to our values. Sometimes the most valuable inheritances can't be measured in dollars or deposited in bank accounts. Sometimes they come in the form of validation, opportunity, and the resources to amplify work that already matters. Martha had given me more than money. She'd given me the confidence to trust my own judgment about what constituted a meaningful life. She'd shown me that success could be measured in thank you letters from grateful families, in scholarships that changed students' futures, and in the quiet satisfaction of work that made the world better for people who needed it most. My sisters still don't fully understand my choices, but they no longer dismiss them as failures of ambition or imagination. The inheritance forced them to reconsider their assumptions about success and worth, even if they haven't embraced my definition entirely. We're building a different kind of relationship now, one based on mutual respect, rather than hierarchical judgment, though it remains fragile and requires constant attention. But perhaps most importantly, I've learned that the greatest inheritance isn't money or property or investment portfolios. It's the gift of being seen and valued for who you truly are, of having someone believe in your potential when others see only limitations. Martha gave me that gift along with her fortune, and it turned out to be the part that mattered most of all. 6 months later, I stood in the ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel, addressing an audience of Chicago's most prominent philanthropists and community leaders at the inaugural Martha Rodriguez Foundation Gala. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now the one commanding attention in an elegant venue, wearing a designer gown that cost more than my former monthly salary, speaking to people who controlled millions in charitable giving. Yet despite the glamorous setting, my focus remained exactly where it had always been, on the families and communities whose lives could be transformed through strategic investment in education, job training, and social services. When my great-aunt Martha left me her inheritance, I said into the microphone, looking out at the sea of formally dressed attendees. She included a letter explaining that true wealth isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you contribute. Tonight we celebrate not just the launch of this foundation, but the principle that drove Martha's remarkable life, that those who have been blessed with resources have a responsibility to lift up those who haven't had the same opportunities. In the audience, I spotted Jessica and Amanda sitting at a table near the front, both dressed impeccably and wearing expressions of what appeared to be genuine pride. Their transformation over the past months had been gradual but undeniable. Jessica had begun volunteering regularly at our legal clinic, helping low-income families navigate housing disputes and immigration paperwork. Amanda had started a financial literacy program that taught basic banking and investment concepts to single mothers trying to build economic stability for their families. The change hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been without friction. There had been heated conversations about my decision to decline their offer of family advisory services, uncomfortable moments when their volunteer work exposed them to realities they'd never encountered in their professional lives, and awkward adjustments as they learned to relate to me as someone with substantial resources, rather than the family member they'd always pitied. But something fundamental had shifted in our relationships. Jessica no longer introduced me with disclaimers about my career choices, and Amanda had stopped making subtle suggestions about when I might pursue real work. They'd begun to understand that my definition of success had always been different from theirs, and that difference didn't make it less valid or valuable. The gala itself represented everything I'd learned about balancing Martha's legacy with my own vision. Instead of a traditional charity auction focused on expensive prizes and social status, we'd created an evening that highlighted the actual impact of community programs. The centerpiece wasn't a celebrity performer or luxury vacation package, but a presentation by scholarship recipients, job training graduates, and families whose lives had been stabilized through emergency assistance programs. Maria Gonzalez, the woman who'd earned her GED through our adult education program, spoke about how stable employment had allowed her to move her family out of subsidized housing and into a neighborhood with better schools. Her daughter Sophia, now a high school senior, announced her acceptance to Northwestern University with a full academic scholarship. Carlos Santos, the college sophomore who'd returned to volunteer over winter break, described his plans to open community centers in underserved neighborhoods throughout the Midwest after completing his degree. Each story represented the kind of transformation that money alone couldn't buy, but that strategic investment could make possible. The audience listened with the kind of respectful attention usually reserved for financial presentations or legal arguments. But there was something deeper happening in the room. These weren't abstract statistics about poverty and education. They were real people describing real changes that had ripple effects extending far beyond individual families. Henrik Larsson sat at the head table. Having flown in from Switzerland specifically for the event, his presence added gravitas to the occasion, but more importantly, it represented continuity between Martha's vision and my implementation of her legacy. During the cocktail hour, he'd pulled me aside to share updates about the international components of Martha's estate, including properties in Geneva and Zurich that could be sold to fund additional program expansion. "Your great-aunt would be enormously proud," he'd said, surveying the elegant crowd gathered to support community development initiatives. "She always believed that wealth was wasted if it didn't create opportunities for others to build better lives. This foundation represents exactly what she hoped would happen when she chose you as her heir." His words carried special weight because they came from someone who'd known Martha during her most successful years, who'd witnessed her evolution from a young immigrant with limited resources to an international businesswoman with vast holdings. He'd also seen her deliberately choose a modest lifestyle in her final years, living simply while her investments continued growing exponentially. Her decision to leave everything to me hadn't been impulsive or sentimental. It had been the culmination of decades of careful observation and strategic thinking. As the evening progressed, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed since that humiliating dinner at the Palmer House Hotel. The external circumstances were obviously different, but the internal transformation was more significant. I no longer felt the need to justify my career choices or defend my values against family criticism. Martha's inheritance had given me financial security, but more importantly, it had validated my belief that success could be measured in ways that had nothing to do with salary figures or professional titles. The foundation's first year had exceeded every goal we'd established. We'd tripled the capacity of our food pantry, expanded the after-school tutoring program to serve 3 additional neighborhoods, and launched a job training initiative that had achieved an 87% placement rate for graduates. We'd also begun planning satellite locations in other cities, starting with Milwaukee and Detroit, where similar community-centered approaches could address local needs while maintaining the personal connections that made our Chicago programs so effective. But perhaps the most satisfying development had been the evolution of my relationship with the community center staff and volunteers. Initially, there had been concern that my newfound wealth would change my commitment to hands-on involvement in daily operations. Some worried that I'd become a remote figurehead who wrote checks but lost touch with the families we served. Others feared that the foundation's resources would attract attention from outside organizations seeking partnerships that might compromise our independence. Those concerns had proven largely unfounded. I still worked regular hours at the community center, still knew the names of children in our programs, and still participated in the mundane tasks that kept our services running smoothly. The difference was that we no longer operated on shoestring budgets or worried about whether grant funding would arrive in time to meet payroll obligations. We could plan long-term initiatives, invest in staff training and development, and respond quickly to emerging needs without waiting for bureaucratic approval from external funders. The foundation had also attracted attention from other philanthropists and community organizations interested in replicating our model. I'd been invited to speak at conferences, serve on advisory boards, and consult with groups trying to establish similar programs in their own communities. These opportunities had introduced me to a network of people who shared my values and approach to social change, creating collaborative relationships that amplified our impact far beyond what any single organization could achieve alone. During the gala's silent auction, I noticed Uncle Robert bidding aggressively on a weekend getaway package to Wisconsin's Door County. He'd been one of the first family members to reach out after news of my inheritance had spread beyond our immediate circle, suddenly remembering shared interests and family connections that had seemed insignificant when he thought I was just the niece who worked with poor people. His enthusiasm for family reunification felt transparently motivated by financial considerations, but I'd chosen to engage with him politely while maintaining clear boundaries about his involvement in foundation activities. The evening's keynote speaker was Dr. Angela Morrison, a nationally recognized expert on poverty reduction and community development. She'd flown in from Washington, D.C. specifically to address our audience about the importance of locally controlled initiatives that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms of economic inequality. Her presentation highlighted research showing that community-based programs with stable funding and local leadership achieved better long-term outcomes than top-down interventions managed by distant bureaucracies. The Martha Rodriguez Foundation represents a model that other communities should study and adapt, Dr. Morrison said during her 20-minute address. Too often, charitable giving focuses on immediate relief rather than systemic change. What makes this foundation exceptional is its commitment to building local capacity while maintaining deep connections to the people it serves. Emma Rodriguez hasn't just inherited wealth, she's inherited responsibility, and she's exercising that responsibility in ways that honor both her great-aunt's legacy and her own community's needs. The validation from someone of Dr. Morrison's stature was gratifying, but it also reminded me of the ongoing pressure to prove that Martha's faith in me had been justified. Every program we launched, every family we served, every success story we documented became part of an ongoing demonstration that wealth could be a force for positive change when managed by someone who understood its proper purpose. As the formal program concluded and guests moved to the reception area for dessert and networking, I found myself in conversation with a diverse group of community leaders, foundation executives, and program participants. The mixing of different social and economic backgrounds would have been unusual at most charity events, where donors and beneficiaries typically remained segregated. But I'd specifically requested that our gala break down those artificial barriers, creating opportunities for direct interaction between people who funded programs and people whose lives were affected by them. Sofia Gonzalez, Maria's daughter who just announced her Northwestern acceptance, was deep in conversation with Margaret Thornton, a retired executive who'd contributed significantly to our scholarship fund. They were discussing Sofia's plans to study education policy, with Mrs. Thornton sharing insights about graduate school opportunities and internship programs that could enhance Sofia's preparation for a career in educational reform. Nearby, Carlos Santos was explaining his community center expansion plans to a group of potential investors, his passion for the work evident in every gesture and inflection. His presentation was polished but authentic, demonstrating the kind of leadership development that happened naturally when young people were given meaningful opportunities to contribute to important work. These spontaneous conversations represented exactly what Martha had envisioned when she'd written about the importance of creating connections between people with resources and people with needs. The foundation wasn't just funding programs, it was building relationships that could sustain positive change long after specific grants ended. Jessica approached me during a brief lull in the networking activity, carrying 2 glasses of champagne and wearing an expression that suggested she wanted to have a private conversation. We moved to a quieter corner of the reception area, where the music and general chatter provided enough background noise to ensure privacy. "Emma," she said, handing me one of the glasses, "I owe you another apology. Not just for the things Amanda and I said at the family dinner, but for years of not understanding what you were building here. Tonight has been eye-opening in ways I didn't expect." Her voice carried the kind of sincerity that couldn't be manufactured, suggesting she'd reached conclusions that went beyond simply accepting my changed financial status. "What do you mean?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective on the evening's events and the broader transformation she'd witnessed over the past months. Jessica gestured toward the reception area, where guests were still engaged in animated conversations about community development, educational opportunities, and social change initiatives. "I've been to hundreds of charity events, Emma. Most of them are really just social gatherings where people write checks to feel good about themselves. But this feels different. Everyone here seems genuinely invested in the outcomes, not just the optics." Her observation was perceptive and accurate. We'd worked hard to create an event that focused on impact rather than image, substance rather than spectacle. The guest list had been carefully curated to include people who shared our commitment to community-centered approaches to social change, rather than simply those who could afford large donations. Amanda and I spent years thinking that success meant accumulating things and advancing through hierarchies, Jessica continued. We measured our worth by our job titles and our bank balances, and we assumed everyone else should do the same. But watching you tonight, seeing the respect and affection people have for you, understanding the scope of what you've accomplished, I realize we were wrong about what matters. Her admission was more generous than I'd expected, and it reflected genuine growth rather than simply strategic positioning for access to foundation resources. The volunteer work she'd been doing had exposed her to clients whose challenges couldn't be solved through legal maneuvering alone, families whose needs required the kind of sustained support and personal attention that characterized effective community programs. I don't think you were wrong about what mattered to you, I replied carefully. You and Amanda have built impressive careers and contributed to your fields in meaningful ways. We just had different definitions of success and different ways of measuring value. My response was diplomatic but honest, acknowledging their achievements while maintaining my own perspective on what constituted a meaningful life. Amanda joined our conversation, having finished her discussion with Dr. Morrison about potential collaboration between the foundation and other community development initiatives. Her face glowed with excitement about possibilities for expansion and replication that hadn't existed before Martha's inheritance provided the necessary resources. Dr. Morrison thinks our model could work in at least a dozen other cities, Amanda said, clearly energized by the potential scope of future impact. She's connected to foundations and community organizations throughout the Midwest that have been looking for exactly this kind of locally controlled approach to social change. Her enthusiasm was infectious and reminded me why I'd initially been attracted to her intelligence and ambition, before family dynamics had created barriers between us. The three of us stood together, sisters who'd spent years misunderstanding each other but were finally beginning to recognize common ground that had always existed beneath surface disagreements. We still had different strengths and different priorities, but we'd discovered shared values that could support collaboration rather than competition. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, I found myself surrounded by staff members, volunteers, and program participants who'd made the gala possible through months of planning and preparation. Their pride in the event's success was evident, but more importantly, their commitment to the Foundation's mission had been strengthened by witnessing community support from unexpected quarters. The financial results exceeded our most optimistic projections. We'd raised enough money to fund program expansion for 3 years, while building an endowment that would ensure long-term sustainability. But the intangible outcomes were equally valuable. New partnerships with organizations that shared our approach, increased community awareness of our programs, and enhanced credibility that would open doors for future collaboration. Henrik Larsson found me during the final cleanup, as our event coordination team was overseeing the breakdown of displays and decorations. His expression conveyed satisfaction with the evening's outcomes, but also something deeper that suggested emotional connection to Martha's legacy and its continuation through the Foundation's work. Your great-aunt would have loved this evening, he said, surveying the ballroom where evidence of our successful event was being carefully packed away. She always believed that her wealth should be used to create opportunities for others, and tonight demonstrated that belief in action. You've honored her memory while building something uniquely your own. His words carried special significance, because they came from someone who'd known Martha during her most productive years, who'd witnessed her careful planning for this eventual transfer of resources and responsibility. He'd also seen my evolution from uncertain inheritor to confident foundation leader, a transformation that validated Martha's judgment about character and potential. The drive home that night took me through neighborhoods where foundation programs were already making differences in families' lives. Streetlights illuminated sidewalks where children walked safely to after-school programs, community centers where adults attended job training classes, and small businesses where our economic development initiatives had helped entrepreneurs establish sustainable enterprises. Martha's music box sat on my desk at home, no longer holding secrets but serving as a daily reminder of the responsibility that accompanied great wealth. The broken melody it had once played had been replaced by something more beautiful, the symphony of voices from community members whose lives had been improved through strategic investment in human potential. I'd learned that inheritance meant more than receiving money or property from previous generations. It meant carrying forward values, continuing important work, and using resources wisely to benefit others. Martha had given me financial security, but more importantly, she'd given me validation that community service was valuable, worthy of substantial investment. My relationship with Jessica and Amanda continued evolving as they found ways to contribute their professional skills to foundation initiatives while developing deeper understanding of community needs and effective responses. Their involvement remained voluntary and part-time, but their commitment had proven genuine and their contributions valuable. The Foundation's second year promised even greater impact as we implemented lessons learned from our initial programs and expanded into new geographical areas. We'd established partnerships with universities interested in studying our model, corporations seeking authentic community engagement opportunities, and government agencies looking for effective approaches to social challenges. But perhaps most importantly, we demonstrated that inherited wealth could be a force for positive change when managed by someone who understood that true success meant lifting others up, rather than simply accumulating personal assets. Martha's legacy lived on through every scholarship awarded, every family stabilized, and every community strengthened through foundation programs. The music box's silence had become more eloquent than any melody, representing the transformation of broken things into sources of beauty and hope. Sometimes the most valuable inheritances can't be measured in dollars or displayed in bank statements. Sometimes they come in the form of trust, opportunity, and the resources to make dreams possible for people who need them most. 2 years after that transformative evening at the Palmer House Hotel, I found myself standing in the gardens of Martha's former cottage in rural Wisconsin, finally ready to visit the place where my great-aunt had spent her final years in deliberate simplicity. The property had been part of her estate, and I'd been avoiding this pilgrimage while focusing on foundation work and program expansion. But something about the approaching anniversary of her death had compelled me to make this journey, to understand more fully the woman whose legacy had reshaped not just my life, but my understanding of what it meant to live with purpose. The cottage was smaller than I'd remembered from my single childhood visit decades earlier, a modest 2-bedroom structure surrounded by carefully tended flower gardens and vegetable plots that spoke of someone who found joy in nurturing growing things. Henrik Larsson had arranged for the property to be maintained exactly as Martha had left it, and walking through rooms filled with simple furniture and personal mementos felt like stepping into a meditation on contentment and deliberate living. In her study, I discovered journals that Henrik had mentioned but I'd never felt ready to read. Martha had documented not just her business decisions and investment strategies, but her thoughts about family, legacy, and the responsibility that accompanied wealth. Reading her reflections on my career choices, written years before she'd made her final decisions about inheritance, was both humbling and affirming. Emma reminds me of myself at her age, one entry read, choosing principle over profit, service over status. The family sees this as failure, but I recognize it as courage. She's building something that matters, even though she lacks the resources to build it properly. Perhaps someday I can change that. The prescience of her observations, written when I was still struggling to establish the community center's basic programs, revealed the depth of attention she'd paid to my choices despite our family's general dismissal of her opinions. Another entry, dated just months before her death, captured her hopes for what my inheritance might accomplish. I've spent 30 years accumulating wealth in a foreign country, deliberately distancing myself from family members who valued money over character. But wealth without purpose is meaningless, and I've finally found the purpose that will give meaning to everything I've built. Emma will know what to do with this legacy. She already understands that true success means lifting others up, not climbing over them. These private thoughts, never intended for my eyes, provided insight into Martha's motivations that went far beyond the formal documents Henrik had shared. She hadn't just been impressed by my community work. She'd seen in my choices a validation of her own values and a continuation of principles she'd maintained throughout her remarkable life. The cottage also contained boxes of correspondence with community leaders, social workers, and educators from around the world. Martha had been quietly funding small-scale initiatives for decades, supporting exactly the kind of grassroots programs that the foundation now operated on a much larger scale. Her philanthropy had been as private as her wealth, focused on impact rather than recognition, effectiveness rather than visibility. Among these papers, I found letters from Carlos Santos's mother, thanking Martha for a scholarship that had helped Carlos attend a summer academic program years before I'd ever met him. There were also thank you notes from other families whose children had benefited from educational opportunities Martha had funded through intermediary organizations, never revealing her identity or seeking credit for her generosity. The discovery that Martha had been supporting community members long before my inheritance created an even deeper connection between her legacy and the work I'd chosen to continue. She hadn't just decided to trust me with her wealth, she'd been testing that trust through years of observation, watching how I handled responsibility and whether my commitment to service remained consistent when faced with family pressure to pursue more lucrative opportunities. As I explored the cottage's modest rooms, I understood more clearly why Martha had chosen to live so simply despite her vast resources. Every object served a purpose, every piece of furniture reflected functionality rather than status, and the overall atmosphere suggested someone who had found peace through deliberately choosing enough over more. Her lifestyle hadn't been about deprivation. It had been about freedom from the endless pursuit of material accumulation that trapped so many wealthy individuals. The afternoon light filtering through the cottage's windows reminded me of the community center's atmosphere during busy program hours, when families gathered to access services and children worked on homework assignments with volunteer tutors. There was something sacred about spaces where people came together to solve problems and support each other's growth, whether it was Martha's quiet retreat or our bustling urban facility. That evening, as I prepared to return to Chicago, I called Jessica and Amanda to share what I'd discovered about Martha's hidden philanthropy and her long-term observation of our family dynamics. Both were fascinated by these revelations, particularly the evidence that Martha had been supporting community members for decades without seeking recognition or gratitude. It makes me wonder how many other wealthy people are quietly funding important work without anyone knowing, Jessica said during our conference call. We always hear about the big donors who get their names on buildings, but maybe the most effective philanthropy happens invisibly. Her comment reflected growth and understanding that had continued evolving through her volunteer work with our legal clinic. Amanda added her own insights about Martha's investment philosophy, noting how her portfolio had consistently prioritized companies with strong environmental and social governance practices decades before such considerations became mainstream. She wasn't just accumulating wealth, Amanda observed. She was investing in businesses that aligned with her values, even when those choices might have limited her returns in the short term. These conversations with my sisters had become regular occurrences, replacing the stilted family gatherings of previous years with genuine exchanges about work, values, and shared commitment to the Foundation's mission. They'd both increased their volunteer involvement significantly, with Jessica establishing a legal aid clinic that operated out of the community center, and Amanda creating financial literacy workshops that had become some of our most popular programs. The transformation in our relationships hadn't been immediate or effortless, but it had been authentic. Working together on projects that mattered to all of us had created common ground that our previous family interactions had never provided. We'd learned to appreciate each other's strengths, while accepting differences in approach and priority that had once seemed irreconcilable. During my drive back to Chicago, I reflected on how dramatically my understanding of success and worth had evolved since that humiliating evening at the Palmer House Hotel. The inheritance had certainly provided financial security and resources for program expansion, but the more significant gift had been Martha's validation of choices that others had criticized or dismissed. The Foundation's impact had continued growing exponentially. We'd established community centers in 6 additional cities, funded hundreds of scholarships, and developed programs that were being studied and replicated by organizations throughout the country. But the metrics that mattered most to me remained deeply personal. Individual success stories, families whose circumstances had improved, children who discovered their potential through educational opportunities. Carlos Santos had graduated from college and opened his first community center in Milwaukee, using foundation funding and mentorship to establish programs specifically designed for Latino families navigating immigration challenges and economic uncertainty. His success represented exactly the kind of leadership development that Martha had envisioned. Talented individuals from underserved communities being given resources to become change agents in their own neighborhoods. Sofia Gonzalez was completing her junior year at Northwestern, majoring in education policy and conducting research on community-based approaches to academic achievement. She planned to write her senior thesis on the Foundation's model, analyzing outcomes data to identify best practices that could inform similar initiatives in other regions. These young leaders represented the Foundation's most important legacy, proof that strategic investment in human potential could create exponential returns that benefited entire communities. They weren't just success stories. They were proof of concept for approaches to social change that prioritized local leadership and sustainable impact over quick fixes and external interventions. The music box remained on my desk at the community center, its silent presence a daily reminder of the unexpected ways life could change when we remained true to our values. Children who visited my office were often curious about the ornate wooden box, and I'd developed a simplified version of Martha's story that emphasized the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to discover hidden value. Sometimes the most precious gifts don't look impressive at first, I'd tell them. What matters isn't how something looks from the outside, but what it contains, and what you do with it once you understand its true worth. These conversations with young people often led to deeper discussions about their own potential, their goals, and the resources available to help them achieve their dreams. As the Foundation prepared to enter its third year of operation, I felt confident that Martha's trust in me had been justified. We'd built something sustainable and scalable, something that honored her memory while addressing contemporary challenges in ways she would have applauded. The work continued evolving and expanding, but its core mission remained constant, creating opportunities for people to build better lives for themselves and their families. The cottage in Wisconsin had been converted into a retreat center, where Foundation staff and community partners could gather for strategic planning and reflection. The peaceful environment that had nurtured Martha's final years now served as a space where others could think deeply about social change and their roles in creating more equitable communities. Standing in that garden, surrounded by flowers Martha had planted and tended, I understood that inheritance meant more than receiving assets from previous generations. It meant accepting responsibility for continuing important work, using resources wisely to benefit others, and ensuring that positive change extended far beyond individual circumstances. The broken music box that had once symbolized my supposed failure had become a metaphor for transformation itself, proof that things which appear worthless or damaged might contain extraordinary potential waiting to be discovered and developed. Martha's legacy lived on not just through Foundation programs, but through every person whose life had been improved by strategic investment in human dignity and potential. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.